All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Whether you are watching me live here or watching the recording back on YouTube, thanks for tuning into the show. If you have watched us before on Office Hours, welcome back. And if this is your first time watching, welcome and thanks for tuning in. This is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, about sports betting, whatever you guys want to talk about, whatever questions you guys have. We answered them live on stream. I am live here for a reason. That's because I want clarifying questions and I want follow-up questions and I want you guys to be part of a conversation. We've had some really good dialogues back and forth with some awesome chat interaction in the last couple days. So let's keep that up. Let's keep it going. That is why we do these live. I host this show every weekday, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And once a week, we use this time slot for what we've been calling a strategy session, where typically a couple other members of the SaberSim team excuse me, will join me here on stream, and we will be doing a deep dive into a specific sport or contest type or topic area or something like that, whatever we feel is relevant for that week based on the questions we've been getting. And this week, I mentioned here yesterday, we are going to be focusing on MLB showdowns. We've got a Red Sox-Yankees single game slate on Thursday night with the return of the second half of the baseball season. There are baseball showdowns on every single slate. A few of us here at the SaberSim team have been having quite a bit of success with them this season. So we want to do a little bit of showdown-specific content for you guys. I believe we will be hosting that tomorrow here in this slot. So 2 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, MLB Showdown strategy session in preparation for Thursday's Red Sox-Yankees showdown slate, which probably will have some pretty decent-sized contests. Should be a lot of fun. So let's see. I've got a few questions in my queue here today. Not too much. We had a great stream yesterday. I was on here almost for 90 minutes answering questions and talking through things and just chatting with you guys. So if you have any questions, anything you want to talk about at all, pop it into the YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel on Slack. Last note before I go ahead and get rolling here, if you are not in our Slack community, highly recommend it. There's awesome conversation going on there every single day. We've got a great community. There's a link to join our Slack community in the description of every Office Hours video on our YouTube channel. So as soon as I hop off here today and get the description up for this video with timestamps and things like that, this video will have a link. But if you want that link now, any of our past videos always have that link to join our Slack community. So definitely recommend that. There's always a lot of these questions start in Slack, and there's some interesting conversation going on ahead of time there. And then, of course, after I hop off of the stream every day, a lot of times there's some follow-up conversation going on in various channels on Slack. Really just an awesome community to be a part of. So highly recommend it if you are not already in there. Let's see. I will go ahead and just jump in. We are now here at day 2 of the MLB All-Star break. So, of course, no main slates to play tonight, but I still see some solid baseball questions, some plenty of things to talk about. And we do, of course, have a major this week in golf and plenty of other sports going on. So plenty to talk about here. Excuse me. So I will just go ahead and jump in. It seems like the questions that I have in the queue here today are a bit of follow-up from some of the questions we've been talking about recently. So we will just kick it right off here with a question that came in from Jay. And he said, noticed in the MLB lineups alert channel some sim updates noting model adjustment. Are these sim kickoffs representing the manual tweaks the team is making to the model? Is it possible for alerts to note what is being tweaked in the model? Going along here, could this update be talked about through a bit more in Office Hours? Awesome. Cool. So starting at the beginning here, if you are not in our Slack community, another great reason to join is we do have these channels set up. This one here, MLB lineup alerts. We've got channels set up in Slack that automatically send a message anytime a lineup comes out, or if there is news being tweeted from the Fantasy Labs MLB Twitter that I know pretty much everybody that plays baseball DFS follows. So you can get those alerts live in Slack. And we also will send a message anytime we run a new sim for a game. There'll typically be a tag associated with it, as Jay has called out here, explaining why that sim has run. You'll see initial sim when we first sim the game for a new slate, and also when lineups get confirmed, if roof statuses change, when the umpires get confirmed, all these different reasons why we may want to re-sim a game. But we do have a new sim here that a few users have noted recently that does say model adjustment. So that is what Jay mentioned here is correct. These manual tweaks, and what he is referring to is are fairly new, or at least fairly newly improved manual review process of our simulations that Matt and Will were on here talking about a few weeks ago in a strategy session. So I will link the video to that in the description of this video. It's called How Our Baseball Model Works or something like that. We talked almost for a full hour about the intricacies of the baseball model, our manual review process, a bit more in detail about what we're doing in that manual review. So that will go into more detail than I can do here on this stream. But that is basically why you are seeing these sims. So a few of those reasons could be if we believe that a pitcher is on a pitch count, or if there is potentially an injury that is not being taken into account in the model. Also, if there are concerning Vegas trends on that game, particularly if the Vegas line is moving quickly and further away from SaberSim, we sometimes make some minor adjustments to take that into account, and really all in the name of having the most accurate projections possible. So that is basically what is going on there. That is why those sims run. I do think there was a note here about adding a detail to the alert to say what is being tweaked in the model. I think that's a really good idea. I actually already passed that along to the rest of our team here. We do want to increase the transparency overall and actually end up creating some content around these manual reviews of our model going forward. So that's something we're working on as we continue to get this dialed in. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I do think it's a pretty decent idea to have at least a little bit of a note there or a tag that says this was a model adjustment because of a pitch count, or this was a model adjustment because of Vegas trends or something like that. I think those are interesting ideas. So I have passed that along to the team. We'll take a look and see how feasible that is, but I think that's a really strong idea. So thank you for your question, Jay. Hopefully that kind of gives enough detail. Again, if you are more interested in learning about the intricacies of the model, a little bit more detail about what that rigorous manual process looks like each day, Matt and Will talked at length about that in the strategy session from a few weeks ago. So it is up on our YouTube channel. It will be in the description of this video. Definitely recommend checking that out. So I will go ahead and leave that one there for now. Cool. And then let's see, I had another question here. This came from Shiver Me Ginger as some follow-up to some of the questions I had answered yesterday here. Let's go ahead and pull this in. And he said, you mentioned for upside builds, you turn ownership all the way down and smart diversity all the way up for viable GPP builds. Why wouldn't you turn ownership all the way up and smart diversity up to get the max diverse lineups that have upside and lower ownership? So kind of filling in the gaps here, what Shiver Me Ginger is referring to are these build types that we first talked about here again in a strategy session last week with Max that I think we've now started. I think I probably started this, but we've been typically just calling them upside builds or something like that. You could also think about them as optimal builds. And let me go ahead and pull up the app here so I can share my screen along. And the purpose of this is basically to get an idea of what optimal lineups might look like for a given slate, right? This is used as a research tool to see how often a certain team may be showing up as a stack in optimal lineups, and then starting to find maybe some teams that are going overlooked, that aren't going to have very high ownership, that show up in a great deal of lineups. So we first talked about this in the strategy session from last week. Again, I will link that video in the description here. But what we typically recommend is turning ownership fade all the way off and turning smart diversity all the way up. We've been leaving correlation at 8, or not at 8 necessarily, but at the default value for the contest, to allow us to get some stacks here. In reality, I think maybe the most proper way of doing this, you would actually turn correlation down to 0 as well. Running a build at these settings is literally going to give you possible mathematically optimal lineups, like the highest score possible lineups on a given slate by using single game simulation examples to build your lineups, right? So let's run this build. Let's see what we get, right? This, I think, is maybe the purest way of running this upside build. The difficulty here, first of all, is that when correlation is down all the way at 0, you're not going to get as many stacks, particularly on a bigger slate. because the mathematical optimals that typically come out of a slate on it, especially like an 11 gamer, typically don't always look like very big stack lineups, right? You might have the one guy that hit 2 home runs from one team and the other guy that hit a home run and had 2 stolen bases on the other team. And all of the highest scoring plays throughout the slate are going to show up in these lineups. So you can still run the build this way. You'll see we still get some stacking here, right? But we have games that are like 2-2 stacked where, for example, 2 Baltimore guys have a huge game and 2 Philly guys have a huge game, but then we're doing one-offs from all the other teams. The reason we typically don't run the build this way, you can, again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think you can still pull some information, is that these lineups just don't actually look enough like lineups we would actually want to play. They don't help us in researching stacks. So that is why I typically recommend running the build at this setting to allow yourselves that correlation component to still see stacks and get stacked type lineups. Now, as for the question about ownership fade, again, the reason we have ownership fade at 0 instead of 10 for this particular type of build is because we want those theoretically mathematical optimal lineups to show up, right? For our research purposes, at least for the way we described it in the video, we don't actually want to see the effects of ownership play a role in these lineups. We just want to see agnostic to ownership. So let's run another build here at these settings. What are teams that possess the enough upside to possibly show up as the optimal stacks when this slate plays out the one single time it does, right? When we have smart diversity at 10, we're using single game simulations to determine projections for every player before we put them in the lineup. The slate itself is actually going to just play out one time. So we're getting an idea of teams that may possess upside. Now, this idea overall of turning ownership up to 10 and smart diversity up to 10 as a way to look at maybe your highest leverage opportunities, I think is interesting. And the goal of this content that we've been putting out in these strategy sessions is entirely intended to get you guys thinking about these kinds of things, right? It's not our intention necessarily to say this is the way to use SaberSim to research, but this is a way to use SaberSim to research. And if you think in your process you can see some viability of running another build where you're turning ownership fade all the way up, great. I think that's interesting. I think that's pretty neat. So like, first of all, right, we're looking at this here. Let's go back and let's expand our pool all the way. So this was the build we ran at 8-0-10, right? So this is kind of our upside build, our optimal builds. What are the teams that are showing up in our stacks, right? So we get an idea of what teams show up in optimal lineups and how often they show up in optimal lineups. So again, we've talked a lot at length about how you can use this. You can see maybe possibilities for lower owned teams. You can look at opportunities for teams that maybe have lower run totals that are showing up or have possessed some of that upside potential, particularly in big 5 stacks, I think is where this gets really interesting. So if we look at, we'll go back here and view our 5 stacks. Right, this is one of the ways this can be really useful. And looking at some of these teams, I think we talked about yesterday, New York was kind of an interesting one that had a lower team total. Again, this is just Sunday slate. We don't have active slates for tonight, so we're reviewing this with some hindsight. But I know Boston, Philly, Minnesota, and the White Sox were probably all pretty chalky. But then we start to see teams with viability here, even as big 5 stacks that show up and that have some upside. 4 stacks as well that maybe weren't the most chalky teams, a research tool to maybe find some of those low-owned opportunities. I do think this build idea of running a build at 10 and 10 is another interesting idea, at least for research. I kind of want to run this and just see what comes out of it. My impression here would be that this would be like an ultra leverage build, right? I don't think any of these builds, I don't think these are very much for the purposes of entering your lineups necessarily. But again, as a research tool, I think it's interesting. And I want to see what kind of comes out of this. My impression here of what this kind of build would do for your research would be maybe a way of finding your heaviest opportunities for leverage, right? And maybe it's not something that you leak into your builds heavily, or you lock any of the teams that are showing up here, but it may give you the best opportunities to find some significant leverage spots on the field. So let's go ahead and see what comes out of this. And I will note while this is building here, that this is actually the last question I have in my queue for the day today so far. So if you are watching me live and have a question for me, feel free to shout it out. We're going to have plenty of time to get to whatever questions you guys want today. So, okay, cool. So let's let this this is build now, and let's up this to 500 and start looking. Let's just look at stacks. So we're not seeing a ton of difference at the top, right? It's still some of the same teams show up at the top: Philly, Boston, Minnesota. When maxing out ownership fade, it seems like one of the teams that the builder is likely to sacrifice are the White Sox. But some of these teams that then start to pop on this build are Houston and Tampa Bay, again, New York. So again, we could use this for our research process, go look at some of these teams and see if these are maybe teams that the field is undervaluing, right? Tampa Bay is one in particular. I'm sure they were... yeah, so it was a Robbie Ray chalk slate here on Sunday. I mentioned yesterday I didn't actually play this slate. I was out of town, so I'm looking at this with a bit of fresh eyes, but you can see how that build run at 10 and 10 for ownership fade and smart diversity will show you some like serious leverage positions that could be taken against the field. And it looks like one of them that the builder found was stacking against Robbie Ray, who was the chalkiest or probably one of the chalkiest plays on the slate at pitcher. Pretty interesting idea overall there. Houston is another team that maybe was probably not ultra chalky, but maybe a little bit so, and then still New York. So I think this is an interesting build. I think this is another interesting tool to put in your toolbox for lack of a better word here, in your research process, especially looking for some of those higher leverage positions, some of those plays that maybe like the highest leverage plays on the slate. It makes sense that we would think about a team like the Tampa Bay against Robbie Ray as a leverage position. And I think maybe what's most interesting about this here is it also can provide you some opportunities to find what isn't a leverage play, right? So let's go back here. But we see, right, the big pitchers were Woodruff, Ray, Bassett, and maybe Berrios. And if we go back here, we can look at this. And if you want to play in a leveraged way, or maybe you're playing a top-heavy contest, you can actually kind of see here and start exploring. Give this a second to repopulate here. And we can kind of use this as a tool to say, okay, maybe my best leverage spot if I want to stack against one of the pitchers is Tampa Bay, right? I think Oakland was playing Texas. Texas doesn't show up as viable. Woodruff was playing Cincinnati. It's a team that shows up. Again, we have really high ownership fade here, so these teams are going to show up, but maybe not as viable. I would say I still think the best approach overall is starting your builds instead with this 0-10 upside build instead, and maybe using this 10-10 upside build as a way to support that. The biggest reason I think is you can just find a little bit, you can find plays, you can find upside plays at low ownership running this 0-10 build and then just combining it with your own understanding of where the chalk is likely to be on the slate. And you're actually looking at real optimals, right? Like, sure, Tampa Bay did show up as a leverage spot build when you're running maximum ownership fade. But in reality, they're only showing up in 6% of the overall optimal lineups of 500. It's not a great deal of opportunity compared to some of these teams that probably also have lower ownership, like New York and Atlanta and Toronto and things like that. So I guess in summary here, I definitely don't want to make the statement that there's only one way to do this here. The reason that we talked through in that strategy session, these ideas of these builds at 0 ownership fade and smart diversity 10, is to give us an idea of what the optimal lineups could look like. That's the purposes of setting these sliders out this way. But I think using a build as a research tool, again, where you're using a very high ownership fade to see what maybe the biggest leverage positions are on the slate is interesting. And maybe you find yourself just a bit of leverage on the field that way by leaking a little bit of Tampa Bay or New York or one of those other teams into your lineups, especially if you're playing contests that makes sense to do that for. So, but great question overall. I was going to see if there were any other I don't think there were any other questions. There were a few notes of follow-up for me here. But really, really solid questions overall. And this is, again, I'll just stress the point that this is exactly what we want you guys to be thinking about here. Taking the tools that we're kind of giving you guys of different build types you can run to aid your research process, and then making it your own a little bit, right? If you can find something kind of useful or interesting out of running these builds at different settings, once you kind of start to get the idea of the nuance that's going on behind the scenes with the sliders, I think that's all great. That's very useful. So I see a few other people have joined me up here. We had a little bit of a slower start to the stream, but that's okay. I am through the questions that I had here in my queue for today. We're only about 20 minutes in. We've got plenty of time to talk. I know it's a little bit of a slow time here with no baseball main slates. But any questions for me? Anything that anybody else wants to talk about here on our stream today? We've got plenty of time. If you've been waiting to ask a question for a good opportunity, now's a great opportunity. I'd be happy to hear any questions anyone has. I am really starting to miss some of these slates myself now. The 1 day off is kind of nice. I ended up firing off some stupid bets onto the home run derby last night after we talked about it a little bit on the stream yesterday. I don't think there's a ton of edge in betting or playing DFS for something like the home run derby, but someone asked me about it, so I entered. I threw a few bets in. I bet on Soto and Perez, who was my pick, I guess, in the show yesterday, and I was a little bit bummed out that Perez ended up getting the first round matchup he did against the polar bear, getting knocked out with 28 home runs or whatever he did. But it was a fun home run derby. It was fun to watch. So anyway, kind of just riffing here now. But I guess what I was saying is I'm starting to miss the slates now. After 1 day of All-Star break, it's about enough for me. I'm ready to get back into it. I'm excited for that showdown contest on Thursday evening here. And then Friday, of course, probably a big 14, 15 game slate or something like that. I can't wait till we have new slates to talk about here on our show. But could also talk a little bit of golf if anyone has any golf. We've got the Open Championship this week. We've got a major. I know at the moment we are working through a minor issue with the Sims where everyone is listed at 100%. Oh, nope, we fixed it. We had a small issue earlier today where all golfers were listed at 100% make cut percent. It looks like that's been fixed now, but major weeks are always fun. Happy to answer any questions about golf here if anyone has any. I'll give this a couple minutes here of maybe me just kind of riffing, and then if nothing comes in, I will go ahead and call it a day here on the stream, and we can answer any questions you guys have in the Office Hours channel on Slack if anything comes up. But any other questions for me here on Office Hours today? Did anybody have any Alonso tickets last night for the home run derby? Be curious. I know there was some interesting conversation going on in yesterday's show about that. Does not sound like it. All right, guys, I will go ahead and leave it right there. I know everyone is not here to just look at me on this show here, so I will go ahead and leave it there. We'll stop for today. I know it's a little bit of a slow time in the year, so enjoy the nice break. Again, we will be back here again tomorrow live at 2 p.m. Eastern talking MLB Showdown strategy in preparation for the Red Sox and Yankees Showdown slate that is on Thursday and kicks off the second half of the baseball season. So we're really excited about that. Let us know if you have any questions about baseball showdown strategy overall. We've got plenty to talk about, but happy to answer any questions you guys have. And I will see you guys then. See ya.